Live. Hello and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Testers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for very, very many reasons. What this is just an open conversation. I'm here, I'm chatting, I'm doing my best to make my guesses about who you are, whether you're watching this live with me now or whether you're watching this as a video on demand later. Doing my best to make my guesses about who you are and what you're interested in hearing and how you're interpreting the things I'm saying, how I'm impacting you. For those of you who are willing and able to participate by putting things into the chat, typing comments in, I very much appreciate that because it gives me a lot more information on which to base those guesses about who you are and what you're interested in and how I'm coming across to you and how I'm impacting you. I work with a private therapy practice called Effective Artistry. Our office is located in Northbrook, Illinois. We do individual, couples, family, and group therapy with people in the states of Illinois and Wisconsin. We also work with some coaches who can work with people all over the world via the internet. Those coaches are all executive functioning coaches, but have additional specialties as well. There's business and professional coaching, parenting coaching, creativity and artist coaching. I do my best to read out comments as they come in the chat because we are live streaming on 3 different platforms simultaneously. And you'll only see comments from the platform that you're watching on. So if you're on YouTube and someone makes a YouTube comment, you'd see it, but you wouldn't see one that was a comment from Twitch. So I try to read those out so that we're all on the same page about what's going on because this is a conversation like anything else. When people pay attention to something, the things that they notice impacts what you think and what you feel and what you do, including what you say next. So I'm influenced by whatever people are saying, and please don't hold back. Don't worry about trying to figure out whether what you're talking about is on topic or diversion or anything like that. That's not how this works. We go wherever. If nothing else, I'd rather talk about what you all are specifically interested in than whatever else we're talking about. But aside from that, that's just how conversations are supposed to work, is they go where they go. That's kind of the whole point of, maybe not the whole point, but a large part of the point of conversation is to be influenced by the things that other people say. I think that's all the boilerplatey kind of stuff. It's something that's been coming up a lot lately in my work with clients and people I've been talking with in my personal life and just kind of seeing it around. There seems to be in our culture a lot of confusion between, let me be more specific. What I'm seeing a lot of or hearing a lot about from people is people saying I can do X or Y or Z thing for other people, or I can figure this out for other people or have this impact on other people, but I don't seem to be able to do it to myself. Why can't I? Which is an understandable question because, we tend to think about things as skill sets, right? If I am good at understanding why someone feels the way that they feel, why can't I understand why I feel the way that I feel? If we're identifying it as a skill of being able to tell why someone feels the way they feel. But the truth is that so much of this stuff, there's just a fundamental, unchangeable difference between you, yourself, and other people. You are aware of your subjective internal experience, your thoughts, your feelings, you're aware of those things. Other people, you're not. Now, they can tell you what they're feeling, they can tell you what you're thinking. That's them using action, behavior. They're saying words or in other ways communicating these things to you, and you're aware of the behavior. Now, that lets you draw conclusions about what they're thinking and what they're feeling, but you don't get to observe it directly. You are with yourself 100% of the time, right? If you are conscious, you are aware of yourself to some extent, or the things that are other people, no matter what, no matter how involved you are in their life, you're with them a small percentage of that time, right? The people with whom you're the most involved, and of course there are exceptions to this, right? Where there's no 100%, not even A mother and a newborn child spend 100% of their time in the same place. Uh, but for the most part, most of us, even those that we're closest with, we're not spending more than 50% of our time with them. And aside from that, maybe not aside from that, let me see. We talk about it as internal and external. So the things that happen in the place that only you can observe them, your thoughts and feelings and so on, as well as everything that happens inside of your body, everything that is within you, we can call that internal. Everything that's outside of you, we can call that external. And there are some impacts that really can only happen when an external force is acting on a system, not when the system is acting on itself, right? Let's be more specific. So things like, I am really great at helping other people to be happy, but why can't I do that for myself? That's a specific one that I get a lot. Or I'm great at helping other people. Morning. I have a comment that says morning. I'm really great at helping other people. Why do I struggle to help myself? Some of these things, like help, for example, is a concept that doesn't apply to a person doing it for themselves. I know we do that now. We can talk about certain things through that lens, but there's a reason that we have to call it, self-help, because help in and of itself, that concept is about what one person or one thing is doing for some other thing, not what a thing does for itself. Self-care, self-love, self-acceptance, these things are generally not inherently about what somebody does for themselves. So facetiously, I often respond to questions like this with well, you can touch other people's left elbow with your left hand. Why can't you do it for yourself, right? It's just, you're not built that way. It doesn't work that way. And something that comes up a lot here is people talking about, I often get questions about how do I get myself motivated? And I know we've talked about motivation a good amount, but I don't know, different people, different times. Motivation is one of those concepts that covers a lot. It's a word that gets used to reference many different things, and those different things then get conflated together. But the two that I think most commonly, the two things that people are most commonly referencing is one, what we could otherwise call incentive. So especially when we're talking about motivating another person, how do I motivate them to do whatever? We're talking about how do you incentivize them to do it? If you give them more reason to do it, then you're incentivizing them to do it. There's also, you could help them do it, or various versions of that, which would often, what we're talking about there is not increasing the value of doing the thing, but decreasing the cost. But rarely are people talking about that when they're saying, how do I motivate someone? They usually don't mean, how do I make this easier for them to do? They're usually saying, how do I make it more valuable for them to do? And then the other most common thing we mean by motivation is energy. How many resources, how energized are you? Especially when we're talking about ourselves. I felt motivated, or I'm not feeling motivated. Again, we mean different things sometimes, but most of the time, or more commonly than anything else, it seems what we mean by that is I just don't have impulses to do things that I think would be good to do, right? I intend to do, or want to do, or think would be beneficial, or is important to do, but when I go to do it or think about doing it, I'm just I don't know. And then we're talking about energy usually. So how do I motivate myself is a very important question if we look at it through the lens of how do I manage my resources, right? But oftentimes what people are thinking is that, how do I incentivize myself? And that's not a thing that you can do. That's not how that works. We try, right? People are like, I give myself little treats, or I punish myself, even though people don't usually say it that way. People will set things up if I don't do X, Y, or Z, then I don't get to whatever, right? We set up punishments and rewards for ourselves. But those things have to be influenced, or they have to be applied by an outside force. Because you could just not do them, right? You could just give yourself a reward anyway, or not punish yourself. And even if you follow through on it, it's not the same. It's something that you've decided and you're in control of it, right? It's not an external force acting on you. So we like that, We like the idea of incentive because that's something that can change things in a moment, right? There can be like, if someone's like, hey, do this thing, I'm like, nah. And then they're like, I'll give you $10. Nah, I'll give you $100. Okay, I'll do it, right? Like you increase the value and it can change in a moment, a person's willingness to do it, and then I go do it. Whereas energy management stuff is not something that you can change in the moment, right? You can't just will yourself into having more energy, which is what everybody wants. And I think a big part of the reason that we talk about motivation in that way. Same with when people say things like, you can choose to be happy. There's certainly utility to that phrase, and there's truth to it, depending on how you interpret it. There's truth to it in the sense of like, you can make choices about how you perceive things or about how you take action or how you live your life that lead to you being happier more than not. But this idea that in a given moment, you can just in some way like flip some cognitive levers and now I'm happy, not so much. When you don't have energy, you can't just will yourself into having energy. You can will yourself into spending energy that you can't afford to spend. You can't will yourself into spending energy you literally don't have. So there are some things that no matter what, you can't do. But there's a lot of stuff that you can get yourself to be willing to spend more than it's worth. If someone paid me money to go to bed at a reasonable hour, I'd probably be much more likely to do it. Maybe. I certainly like the idea of that myself, although I have to be honest with myself to like, I don't know, actually. I don't generally, it's not that I'm like, have a problem with authority or whatever, but in a general sense, the way that most people, like, I don't like having other people control my decisions. And so something like when I'm supposed to go to bed, would I be more likely to do it if someone was paying me? Maybe. But I also might be more, oftentimes the reason that I struggle to get to bed earlier, there are different reasons, different days, but one of the things that weighs in is I find this phrase that I'm about to use hilarious, so I'm going to use it, but I also think it's not the best in terms of like the impact it has on how we think about this. But there's a phrase that's gone around the internet, revenge bedtime procrastination, where if a person feels like they haven't had as much free time during a day or the time to do the things that they enjoy, then at night, instead of going to bed at a reasonable hour or when they're supposed to, they'll stay up to do those things, to be like, well, I didn't get to have enough free time or fun today, and I'm going to do that now. It's such a good phrase. That's the comment. It is a hilarious phrase, and it really describes a certain thing, but also has some certain connotations. I use it a lot too. Also, technically, kind of am getting paid to sleep at a reasonable hour, but the correlation of my effectiveness at work to my paycheck is too abstract for my brain. Sure. Also, I would point out that assuming that you're not getting fired because of your performance at work, that whatever you're talking about in terms of like how effective you are, even at your least effective, you're still doing your job. You're getting paid, right? Like you're maintaining your job. You might want to do it better, which is good. I mean, in many ways, it's nice that we enjoy doing what we do or take pride in it or, want to do it really well. There are some downsides to that. It makes it more difficult to assess when you're done if what you're trying to do is not the bare minimum of what you've been asked. That phrase, unfortunately true, that phrase itself, bare minimum, right, that I just used without like consciously selecting it exactly, that's a good example of what I'm talking about, where bare minimum, another way to say that, doing the bare minimum is, meeting the requirements that have been asked of you. But talking about the bare minimum or meeting the requirements, just barely meeting the requirements, as though that's bad, right? There's an implication there that you should be doing more than the bare minimum or just doing what's asked of you or whatever. And of course, in a lot of contexts, that makes sense. And there's reason that we would want to go beyond just the bare minimum. You wouldn't want a life in which all the things you're doing, you're doing it to the bare minimum, because generally, if you're doing something to the bare minimum, it's because you've been asked to or required to in some way by somebody else, not because you are enjoying it yourself. I do want to do better at work and also be healthier, and sleep would certainly help. Hey, I have that shirt. Oh, yeah, it's a nice shirt. Don't forget to love each other. It's a critical role. Yeah, going to sleep earlier is, I want to say, like the most common thing that people, and I'm one of these people, that people will be like, this is a change I need to make for a lot of reasons. Personally, it'll be better, it's healthier, better for me at work, but, and that we then still struggle to do anyway. And actually, this has a lot to do with that kind of energy management stuff. Um, think of it as like, all right, when I'm talking about this resource stuff, I know that there is a tendency for people to interpret the things that I'm saying through this lens of like, that basically I'm just like, hey, everybody should get to do whatever they want, whenever they want. And it's really mean to try and change that for anybody. I understand why people sometimes think that's what I'm saying. It's not at all what I'm saying, but I get it. What I prioritize, the name of the company that I founded is Effective Artistry. What I prioritize is effectiveness, meaning like having the impact that you are intending to have. When you want to accomplish X, you do. That's being effective. Uh, it's just that our culture, I currently have the goal this year of getting 4 weeks in a row in which I get at least 3 work nights of 6.5 hours of sleep. Cool, good for you. Good goal. There's this term market inefficiency that often gets talked about in like the realm of finance and business and whatever, which is to say the market, which is a way of encapsulating like everybody or the communal thinking or whatever. If the market is wrong about something, the market values something, so everybody collectively values something low, but it's actually much more valuable than that. If you can figure that out where the market is wrong, that's a market inefficiency, and you could be very successful and make a lot of money because you have figured something out that the market collectively has missed. Our culture, I think I've gotten 1 week so far with 3 days. Well, good for you. That's progress. The point of setting goals and aims, yeah, but it's a work in progress. The point of setting goals and aims is not just to accomplish them, it's to modify the way in which you spend your resources and the strategies you select so that you get closer. This is part of why we call them aims instead of goals, is that idea of goals being binary, that you've either succeeded or you failed. And if you failed, you failed. One failure is as bad as another. It doesn't matter. And that's not generally true. There are some things where that's the case, especially when it comes to like school and work. There are things where it's like deadline-y things or whatever, and it can be binary. But for the most part in our life, when we're trying to accomplish something, we're setting aims where it's like the closer I get to that, the better off I will be. And so when you do that and you get closer to that, that's a success. Even though you haven't gotten where you set your aim yet, getting closer means that setting that aim helped you. So good for you. It often sounds like I'm talking about like everybody should just do whatever they want, because the market inefficiency when it comes to being effective or productive or whatever in our culture leans way too heavily on the side of just ignore what you think and what you feel and just push. Way too heavily on that side. And so to balance things out, generally we're talking about the other, pulling in the other direction. But of course, it would be true too that if a person is too far on the other side, where they're like never pushing and never doing anything that's difficult or unpleasant, even though it's important or valuable, then we would be pulling them in the other direction, right? Which, for those of you who've been around on this stream, we talk about that stuff a lot, even though it doesn't necessarily sound like that. I think it also is partly just because I seem like a guy who's nice, and I hope that I am. I endeavor to be nice and kind, and people just kind of mentally associate that with the idea that, to do whatever you want. But no, actually, probably the bulk of my work with people is not doing what they want. It's pushing them to do things that they don't want, including even in the conversations that we're having and how we're talking about things. Because oftentimes, I was going to say for the most part, but I don't know that it's true that it's for the most. Oftentimes, the thing that is most beneficial to you, the most worth doing, even considering the cost and whatever, you do seem like a nice guy. I would say thank you. I hope to be. It's often true that the thing that is best for us to do, most helpful to us to do, most valuable, is something that is unpleasant. right? Especially when we're talking about changing ourselves. We have a phrase, change requires discomfort. To do something differently than you typically have done it means that you're putting effort in to do it in some new and different way. It's harder than doing it the way that you would have originally done it. Now, we don't want to always change everything, but that's important. Anyway, so trying to bypass that idea of like, that I'm just like, hey, do whatever you want. Because part of what I'm trying to point out is that like, there are reality. No one argues that things which hurt us, that cause us physical pain, things which cause physical pain are things that our bodies have evolved to identify as problems. Now, sometimes those things, like getting a shot or working out or whatever, sometimes those things we have identified as being beneficial things to us, that they are good things to do. But the body, it can't change that quickly, right? We're talking about millions of years of evolution, billions maybe. And so we have to use reason and logic, cognition to override the impulse that like, even though this hurts, it's good for me to do in the long run. The reverse of that is also true, that things which we enjoy, we've evolved to enjoy those things because they are beneficial to us. In the same way that things which cause physical pain are detrimental to us, things which cause us joy or pleasure are inherently beneficial to us. And just like with pain, that's not always true. Things have changed over the years, right? And now there are things that do feel good, they're enjoyable or pleasurable, that are bad for you. Because the body can't change that quickly. And so yeah, that's true. But we have a tendency as a culture to go way too far in that direction and just write off the idea that something enjoyable is beneficial at all. We think of things that are enjoyable being beneficial only in the sense that they're enjoyable. It's good because you enjoy it, instead of you enjoy it because it's good. And so a lot of what I'm talking about often with people is taking things which are enjoyable, but that people have written off as like, it's bad for you to do, it's a waste of your time or whatever. But it's enjoyable and it's nice to be able to do, so you can do it sometimes or whatever. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, so you should casually stab yourself with a needle throughout the day to grind those power levels. That's funny. So things which are enjoyable, like food, for example, right? Or sleep in some cases. Sometimes everybody has times where going to sleep is like, yeah, man, that sounds great and I love it. And everybody also has times where it's like, it would be better for me to go to sleep, but I don't really want to, or whatever. Those things are enjoyable because they're beneficial. We have evolutionary incentive to enjoy those things so that we do them more. But that's true, at least in theory, and in some way, shape, or form, that's true of everything you enjoy. So a practical way to be looking at this is everybody knows, for example, that, well, maybe not everybody, but hopefully most people understand at this point that sleep is important. That even if, I wish I could just stay up longer and get more stuff done and whatever, but if I don't sleep, I won't be as effective tomorrow, or impact my health or whatever. That's true, but sleep is not the only, if we talk about it through the lens of money, right, there's all kinds of things that spending money on it is really important. Even if it's not enjoyable, it's important to do it. There's things that you're spending money on just because it's enjoyable, hopefully at least some. But ultimately, to spend that money, no matter how important it is, you have to earn it, right? So if we talk about resources in this way, whether it's energy or attention or various other things we have limited amounts of, in order to spend those things, no matter how important, some of the things you're spending it on is fun, some of it is not, some of it's important, some of it's not. No matter how important it is, you have to be able to afford to pay the cost for it. And it's not that something which is enjoyable, like doing something enjoyable, is in and of itself restorative necessarily. The experience of joy is pleasurable, but not necessarily restorative. I mean, maybe a little bit in a certain way. But it is to say that things which are restorative tend to be enjoyable. So the things that we enjoy and pursue, as a general rule, you can assume that you're doing that out of, those things are beneficial to you. They give you resources that you can then go spend on other things. It's not always true. But just like with pain, you should be careful about when you override it, right? Like, is it true that sometimes something which causes physical pain is good for you and worth doing? Yes. When we experience physical pain, do we just automatically assume that it's good for us? No, we stop. Unless we have specific reason to think this is something that's good to do, even though it hurts. Same should be applied to joy. That it is definitely true that things which are enjoyable can be bad for you, but you shouldn't respond to enjoying something with automatically thinking this is not good for me or it's not worthwhile or whatever. It should be, unless you have a very clear and specific reason to think like this is not a good thing for me to do, even though it's enjoyable, which happens all the time, every day, right? Like there's all kinds of things where it's like, ooh, the taste of eating that thing would be really great for me right now, but it would make me feel really bad later and I'd have bathroom issues or whatever. Or like, it would be really nice for me to keep sleeping in right now. That's what would feel most pleasant. But if I do, then I won't be able to get my kids ready for school on time, or I'll be late to my work or whatever thing it is, right? So I'm not saying these are rare circumstances. I'm just saying, unless you have reason, we should go the other direction. So what ends up happening is that we in our culture, we tend to, there's different ways to talk about this. And I smile because depending on who I'm talking to, I'm going to use different language to reference these things. And some of them are pretty fun ways to talk about it. But we have an overfocus on what we would generally call productivity in our culture, which what people usually mean by that is like doing things which aren't fun to do, but are important to do. Usually is what people mean. And it's good that we focus on that because, yeah, you don't, if you let children, like if you let babies just follow their every impulse, nobody's body is ever going to have impulse to do the things that aren't enjoyable in the moment, but are beneficial long term. So we have to be taught that. And once we learn that, there's the kind of this natural consequence of like, oh, sometimes it's good to identify what is the best thing to do logically and do that, even if your impulse is something else, or even if that's not enjoyable or whatever. And so because we do that and it works, we're like, oh, good thing to understand. And I keep looking at things through that lens. And we overdo it then. We start applying it to things more than it should be. And ideally, hopefully what happens is that we recognize that, oh, I've been pushing myself harder than I should. And some of these things that I thought would work out didn't actually benefit me in the long run, whatever. And we scale back. That doesn't always happen. And by and large, our culture has a focus on productivity, on working hard. So we push each other and push ourselves in that direction. We tend to err on that side. Not everybody, nobody all the time. But a big part of what's happening at night then, when people call it revenge bedtime procrastination, or just a general like, I need to get myself to go to sleep early or whatever, what often is happening is that there are things which are restorative, that give us resources when we do them, that we have identified as not being important to do. Sometimes we even identify them as being bad things that I shouldn't do. And so we don't do them all day long. And we're doing the stuff where you have to spend money to do it. We're paying costs in order to be able to accomplish things. And we're putting off the things that you do to earn money, that restore resources. And then by the end of the day, you get to a point where you're out of money because you've been spending it all day and you haven't done any of the things that earn it. And then you default to doing the things that earn you money, that are restorative. Even if you still at that point still think this is a waste and I shouldn't do it, you eventually hit a point where like our ability to override our body's impulses is limited. We can make ourselves do things that are difficult and painful. We can make ourselves abstain from doing things which are enjoyable. But we have limits to be able to do that, right? Everybody knows you can make yourself stay awake even when you're tired. But as time passes and that tiredness increases, your ability to consciously force yourself to stay awake diminishes. And eventually, no matter who you are, eventually you'll hit a point at which you cannot keep yourself awake no matter what you're doing consciously or even in the environment. You will fall asleep. Same with hunger. You can try not to eat and push it off and push it off. Sooner or later, your impulses will get to the point where your body will override your conscious attempts not to eat, and you'll eat. Or trying not to use the bathroom, right? You can hold it in for so long, but eventually you can't. Same thing for emotions. You can try and hold in, I don't want to express to anybody that I'm sad. I don't want anyone to see it. You can do that only for so long until eventually, as time goes on, if you get more and more sad, it becomes harder and harder to do that. And eventually you hit a point where you can't, no matter how hard you're trying. Let's assume for a second, without talking about it in detail, let's assume that something that people commonly do at night when they're trying to go to bed, like playing a game on their phone, is a very common thing. Let's assume that that's enjoyable because it is restorative in some way. Without making the argument, you could say it's not, fine, we don't need it, but pretend that it is for a moment. Wouldn't that explain the pattern, right? That because I have identified this thing, playing this game on my phone, as a waste of time, a bad thing to do, something I shouldn't do, I'm not doing it throughout the day. I'm doing these other things that I think of as good and important things to do. And I'm running out of resources because I'm not doing this thing that helps to restore some of those resources. As I get later and later in the day, it gets harder and harder for me to override that impulse to just sit down and zone out, or whatever you want to call it, and play the game. Until eventually, no matter how hard I try, I'm in bed, I'm like, no, I'm trying to go to sleep. And it's like, no, the impulses went out, I'm doing this thing. Again, I'm not trying to prove to everybody that that is restorative right now. I'm just saying, if you pretended for a moment that it is, wouldn't that make sense? And it does, right? If we've identified something, honestly, I look at a lot of my work with people as the opposite, I think, of what it sometimes gets seen as, where I think of it as people coming in and being like, look, I need to spend more money to buy more stuff. And I keep not buying these things. It's really important that I buy this, and it's really important that I buy that, which I believe, that it's really important. And I'm not doing it. And so the more important something is for you to buy, if you're still not buying it, the more likely it is that the reason you're not buying it is because you can't afford it. And then I'm trying to say, okay, that's really important to buy, and you're not buying it probably because you can't afford it. So we probably need to do the stuff that you have to do to make money, whether you like it or not. If it's important to buy that, you have to earn the money to be able to buy it. Now, because we're talking about energy and other things, that often looks like me talking to people about them needing to engage with their art more, or spend more time playing with their kids, or taking more time to themselves, or letting themselves take longer breaks, or zoning out and playing games on their phone or whatever. Which, because those things are enjoyable, people are like, oh, that sounds really nice, but no, it's bad. But it's not bad. Somebody's saying, I should be able to accomplish more productive things without scaling back on any other productive things I'm doing, or doing additional things that will get me more energy and resources to be productive, is the same as someone saying, I need to spend more money than I'm currently spending, but without cutting back where I'm spending on anything else in my budget, and without doing any of the stuff that earns me more money to be able to afford more. So budgeting instead of just austerity. Yeah, I mean, what's that guideline? 50, 30, 20? I don't know. What is that? Is that a reference to, I know there are some common budgeting ideas of how much you should spend on rent and stuff, and how much you should spend on, is it a reference to that? The last I was told any of this stuff, I think the recommendation at that point was that rent should not be more than 1/3 of your housing expenses, should not be more than 1/3 of your income. It does seem to me, I can't speak to this personally per se because I only have my own experience, but it does seem to me that the rise in housing costs versus the rise in income has meant that the idea of your housing costs being 1/3 of your income or less has become less and less realistic over time, but I could be wrong about that. Yeah, so usually budgeting, when people use that term, usually what people are thinking about is being careful about how you spend money, which is great. And that is usually what people mean by it, for reasons, primarily because, generally speaking, far and away, by far the most common thing is people having a lot of control over what they spend and not much control over how much they earn. We would all love it if it was just go earn more money from your job, just go get more money for doing your work. Everybody would want to do that. Yeah, how much you should spend on needs, wants, savings / debt payments. That's what the 50, 30, 20 rule is. Needs, wants, savings / debt. I do like good, like rule of thumb advice, high level advice. I would never quibble with like not being specific enough or nuanced enough because general advice can't do that. My my hesitation with that framework in particular is it's around the concept of need versus want. Um, Need and want, needs and wants, as in this example, in our culture, we often treat those as like a difference of intensity level, right? Like, I'll be better off if I have the thing that I want. I'll be even better off if I have the thing that I need. Or I'll be worse off if I don't have the thing I want. I'll be even worse off if I don't have the thing that I need. Like, wants and needs are on a spectrum, and there's a certain threshold at which, no, this is no longer a want, it's now a need. But those concepts apply to completely different things. Want is an experience that a person has. You have a want, whether it's a thought or whatever. Yeah, obviously not perfect for everyone, but it's a nice reminder to create space for things you don't necessarily need. Yes, I agree. And that's a great example of what we're talking about, is that the default thought in our culture at this point would be like, only spend money on things you need. And we need prompts and reminders of like, actually it's good, maybe even important to spend resources on things that you just enjoy but don't think are important. Because that I think is what generally, when people are talking about this kind of thing and separating needs from wants, mostly what they mean is like something you want is something that would be enjoyable or pleasant for you to have, but you won't be any worse off if you don't have it. Where a need is like, if you don't have that, your life will be worse than it currently is, right? It helps me to have a set amount of money that I don't need to feel guilty about spending in a given week. Yes, and that is great. Really great. And again, evidence of what I'm talking about, where it's almost kind of like the concept of free time being like, free time is this rare thing that you earn. It's good that we support people and that we get these ideas that make us feel less guilty about this stuff. It's bad that in the first place we feel guilty about it and that that's helpful, right? Or like I'll sometimes say that like, it's a bad thing to be going to the hospital. It's a good thing to be going to have the ability and the option to go to the hospital when you are in a condition that would be benefited by going to the hospital. We'd rather that you never go to the hospital, but in certain contexts, we'd rather you go to the hospital than not. Same here. I would rather you not be feeling guilty about spending money on things that you want. Rather than that, I would rather that you had not been feeling guilty about that in the first place. And obviously that ship has sailed and it doesn't matter. Whatever's helpful is helpful. But further evidence of what I'm talking about, this broad culture-wide sense or concept of effectively, if things are good, or even if things are fine or okay, and you want them to be better anyway, that is at best allowed. Like, okay, I guess you're allowed to make things better even though they're good. And at worst, makes you a bad person, that you're greedy, right? Like you have a lot and you want more, you're greedy, or you're vain. People find you attractive and you want to be found even more attractive, you're vain, or selfish, or whatever. This idea that like, even though something is good, you want it to be better. Like that's bad in our culture. And so then we go about having all these ways to justify, because the rules are like, if something is bad, then you're allowed to want it to be better. So my relationship, right? I'm dating somebody, and not actually dating somebody, I'm making an example. I'm dating somebody and like, it's good. I like them. They like me. Maybe we even love each other. We're in a good place, whatever. But also they keep doing this one thing that like annoys the crap out of me. Now, if that's presented as like, I'm dating somebody and they're wonderful across the board, they're so great, they do this one thing that annoys me, and I say all that, and then I'm like, so I really need them to change that thing, or I might have to break up with them or whatever, then pretty much everybody's going to come back with like, whoa, what are you talking about? You're saying it's great. You can't, you got to learn to just deal with this one thing. It's not a big deal or whatever. If I do the same thing and frame it as like, yeah, they're great at this and this and that, but they do this thing that's awful, that like is inappropriate or unsustainable or toxic or abusive or whatever, then the responses I'm going to be getting are more likely to be along the lines of like, yeah, you shouldn't tolerate that. That needs to change. It doesn't matter how good they are at this, and that. If they do that way, it's unacceptable. So we're incentivized to take things which are different than we would want them to be and view them as being bad things. Now, sometimes those are bad things. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're suboptimal things, right? Something is a 5 out of a 10, and we treat it like it's a -5. There's a Bright Eyes lyric I think about all the time. Oh, I'm excited to see. That also then leads to a tendency to take things which are bad and rate them as even worse than they actually are, right? If things which are a 5 out of a 10, I treat them as a -5, then when something's actually a -5, I can't treat that as a -5 because it's worse than that other stuff that I treat like that, so I have to bump it down too. My mind races with all my longings, but can't keep up with what I've got. Yeah, I like that line. I think I know the song, but it's from but I can't remember the title. And yeah, we talk about this a lot. We talk about it through the lens of gratitude, which is something I know that can be easily dismissed. But if you look into the research, to the tune of Ode of Joy, yeah. Oh, ba-bum. Dun, 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 dun. No, I can't remember that one either, but it's a good one. I forget what I was saying. Oh, yeah, that this is a concept we talk about a lot, sometimes through the lens of gratitude, which people will often dismiss as being like silly or woo-woo, like, oh, you should practice gratitude. Like, okay, whatever. But as though it's like dismissive of your struggles or problems or difficulties. But if you look at the research, the like honest to goodness actual research by Harvard, like the top line stuff on happiness, the things that you get back over and over and over is the number one, like strongest influence by far on how happy a person is are their relationships. That matters way more than anything else. And that in terms of like particular traits or practices or whatever, the thing that is most strongly correlated with people who are happy is some form of gratitude, practicing gratitude or feeling gratitude. So I'm drinking, breathing, writing, singing. Every day I'm on the clock. My mind races with all my longings, but can't keep up with what I got. Yeah. That's what the mind is supposed to do, right? Like, our minds are not meant to, literally cannot, pay attention to what's happening in reality in the moment. What happens in the mind, that's all abstract thought. The map is not the territory. It's useful to help us make plans and understand things and speculate about what might happen if this and if that. It's really useful. But the mind literally has no way to deal with the present moment. The body does, but by the time you consciously are perceiving something, even though it's like a microscopic, insignificant amount of time, some time has passed between when that thing happened and your sense organs detected it and now you're perceiving it, right? If you're standing at the top of the Grand Canyon and looking out over that vista, what you're seeing is one static image. Technically, the light that's hitting your eyes that bounced off the stuff that's miles away, that stuff happened longer ago in the past than the stuff that's right in front of you. Our minds are for considering possibilities, not for taking a look at what's happening right now. Now, in order to be able to consider possibilities with any level of effectiveness, we have to take into consideration reality too. And obviously these things, I'm being so like ridiculously nuanced and specific. In reality, of course, we pay attention to the present moment and whatever, like, even though it's technically not. Because it's important and useful to pay attention to things that happen so that we can run better scenarios about what might. But yeah, ultimately, there is no such thing as a person who doesn't have anything that they would want to be different. There are moments in time, even sometimes extended moments in time, where you're not aware of anything that you would want to be different. But even in those moments, if your attention was called to this or that, as soon as you paid attention to it, you would think, yeah, I would like that to be different. That's part of the issue that comes up with self-acceptance, right? Like, why can I accept other people, but I struggle to accept myself? Because like all these concepts, it means different things. People use it to mean different things at different times. And some of those things are great and possible, and some of those things are not possible and would be good even if you could. So self-acceptance in the sense of, I like everything about myself and there's nothing about myself that I would want to change. That's not possible, and it wouldn't be something that you would want even if you could. That's stagnation. Now, it is theoretically possible to like things about yourself and still want them to change. But that's where we come back to what we were just talking about in our culture is, if you want something to change and it's already good, then we kind of act like there's something wrong with you for that. That's just a want. That's a leisure. You're being greedy, whatever. So we associate this idea that we would want something to be different, or it would be better for something to be different with, and therefore the way that it is bad. And we apply that to ourselves. So if you're talking about self-acceptance in the lens of like, I want my body to be shaped differently than it is, but I like my body the way that it is, I just would like it even better if, as opposed to, I hate my body the way that it is, I would only like it if it was different. If that transition is what you mean by self-acceptance, then yeah, that's possible and that's great, and we want people to do that. But oftentimes by self-acceptance, people mean take the thing that you don't like about yourself or that you wish was different than it is and just be like, no, it's good that it is the way that it is. And that's generally not possible. We want to separate these things. Evaluating it as being good or bad, separate from evaluating whether you would like it to be different or whether it would be good or beneficial for it to be different in some way. But those two concepts are so linked in our culture. And it leads to these inefficiencies where people think, let's take video games. We've talked about video games a good amount. I got a presentation coming up this weekend for a conference talking about, digital media and stuff. Video games are a thing that didn't used to exist, right? It was invented at some point in the last, I don't know, what you want, 50, 60 years, depending on what you would call a video game. If nobody enjoyed video games, then people invent stuff all the time that nobody picks up and doesn't get widely distributed and whatever. If something is invented and distributed and people like it and they spread it more and becomes more popular and bigger and bigger and bigger, then there's some reason, right? And even if all we're going to say is because a lot of people enjoy it, that still in and of itself is meaningful. But let's take it one step further than that. Why do people enjoy it so much? Right? There must be some reason that so many people enjoy it so much, especially when you're working with something like video games, which in our culture, the thinking around it is different than it's changing over time, but still even to this day is very much thought of as a waste of time thing that you should not do. They're like, it's fine to do because it's fun. It doesn't make you a bad person or a weirdo or whatever, but it's not beneficial to do. It's a waste of time and you should do it as minimally as possible and focus on other better things instead. So even though everybody's thinking that all the time, talking about that all the time, even though people who themselves enjoy playing video games also still think like this is bad and I should be doing something else, everybody's still doing it so much, even against that. The harder we try to stop people from doing something and then people keep doing it anyway, the more evidence that there is something about that that is inherently beneficial. And us saying that everybody should stop it, either what we're talking about is that the cost that you're paying for it is not worth the value you get out of it. This is, for example, often the case with like illicit drugs, right? That obviously if we're putting so much effort into trying to stop people from doing heroin and people are doing heroin anyway, that fits the criteria I was just saying. And yes, there must be some value in there. But the reason we're telling people not to do it is because the cost, it's one of those things where like the value is up front and the cost comes later. And because of certain processes, addictive, tolerance, withdrawal, whatever biological processes, it makes it so that when the cost starts to come due, you have a hard time adjusting at that point. So that's one scenario, is that we're telling people not to do it because, not because there isn't any value, but because the cost is not worth paying and you're just not realizing it. The other scenario in which we're telling people not to do something that everybody's doing all the time is that we're wrong. We think that it's bad. We think the cost is greater than it's worth. The value is not up to, but we're wrong. We're missing something. And of course, we might think it's one and it turns out it's the other, and it's a whole tricky thing to tell one from the other. But that's why things like video games get talked about more or less through the same lens as things like heroin. We talk about how many times have you heard somebody say that video games are addictive or social media is addictive? How many times have you heard somebody say that like gardening is addictive or playing sports is addictive, right? How often have you heard people say that video games are bad because any moment you're playing video games is a moment you're not doing this other stuff, which is important. It's a concept we call opportunity cost. And it applies to everything. Every moment you're playing with your children is a moment that you're not doing other stuff, and some of this other stuff is important, but nobody ever references it that way. How many times have you heard people say, playing video games stimulates the same part of the brain as heroin or whatever, by which the part of the brain they're referring to is either they're talking about the pleasure center of the brain, or they're just talking about the release of dopamine. How many times have you heard somebody say something like, I need to do X, Y, or Z, play video games, whatever, to get a dopamine hit or whatever? Dopamine is something that is released whenever somebody is enjoying or feeling satisfied or accomplished about anything. The pleasure center of the brain is lighting up whenever a person is feeling joy or pleasure of any kind for any reason. So again, nobody's ever like, that playing with your kids lights up the same part of your brain as heroin, even though it's the same part of the brain. What we choose to say, we can say things which are true, and the fact that we're saying that true thing but not all these other true things still tells you something about what we're communicating and why. I think we would all be much better off to recognize that if there's something I'm doing consistently, right? We always make mistakes. We think doing this will be a good and useful thing for me to do. We do it and it's not. But humans, we adapt quickly. Did you know that petting your cat lights up the same area of your brain as heroin? Yeah. And this just makes me want to go off on all kinds of like things that are said that are ridiculous. Like, for instance, addiction is a construct. Like tolerance and withdrawal, those are biological things we can observe. Addiction is a construct. It's a concept. It's an idea. And if you pay attention, you'll notice that we only ever reference that concept with things that we generally think of as sinful, more or less. That with rare exceptions, we're not talking about like people being addicted to petting their cat or playing with their kids or gardening or sewing, or we're just talking about things that we think of as like that's a bad thing that you shouldn't do, but people are doing it anyway. Humans adapt quickly. There's all kinds of research about this, but you also have your own personal experience of it. We adapt quickly, very, very fast. If you do something thinking that it will help, even not consciously, your processes just have led to the conclusion that doing this is worth doing, and it hurts you, you stop doing it pretty much right away. Maybe twice, but we stop. If you continue to do something, even if that thing is unhelpful or problematic, if you continue to do it repeatedly, then there's a reason for that. And either it's because that thing is beneficial for you in ways that you don't recognize, or it's because, well, I guess this isn't an either or, this is just different versions. Either it's because even in those instances in which you're doing it but think it's unhelpful, it's actually helpful or valuable in some way. Or it's because you're using it and it's very valuable and you use it a lot for other things, and then mistakenly think that it will be something that's useful in this case and do it in this case, even though it actually is bad. Thinking, for example, very common, this comes up, that I'm overthinking this and I'm ruminating on that. Thinking using cognition is something that you do very successfully with lots and lots and lots of things. And so then you encounter something, you're like, oh, I'll think my way through this. And you try, and that thing, it doesn't work for, it's not good to think on. If you do that again, I'm going to try and think my way through this, even though you can't resolve it that way and it makes it worse for you. and again and again. It means that in between you're using it hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times successfully. Otherwise, you would just stop thinking about stuff. And I know that we don't think that in our culture. People are like, well, how do I get myself to stop thinking about it? Which is really saying, what can I think in order to make myself stop thinking, right? Which doesn't work, because even if it could, you'd have to think the thing in order to stop yourself from thinking, which means that you're now thinking, even though what you're thinking is this thing. We can shift our thoughts. We can shift our attention to other things. There isn't a way for you to just stop yourself from doing it. There's environmental circumstances and context that can stop you from doing it. But this is where we started, right? This idea of I can do X, Y, or Z for others. Why can't I do it for myself? Because there are some things that's just not how it works. You can't. We can consciously influence some things. Other things, you just can't, right? Like, can I increase my heartbeat by just thinking, increase my heartbeat? No. Maybe some people could train themselves to do that, but I can't. Could I increase my heart rate by thinking anxious thoughts? Yes. And if I wanted to increase my heart rate, I could consciously choose to think anxious thoughts that make me anxious and then might make my heart rate increase. Is it perfect control? No, but it's some level of influence. But then there's other things, like if I have a cut that's healing, that for the most part, nothing I can think or do cognitively is going to change the way in which that cut is healing. We can't think our way into having more energy. We can think our way into being willing to spend energy that we weren't before, which you might think of as like getting energy out of nowhere. There was a reference earlier there to having 4 weeks of at least 6.5 hours of sleep at night on a work week. There's interesting research about this. People, our culture very much over relies on cognition. That includes with trying to assess how tired are we. We rely on our conscious sense, our subjective sense of feeling tired. If we evaluate sleep or the lack thereof and how it impacts cognitive performance against how sleep or the lack thereof influences how tired we feel, what we see is that if you're sleeping 8 hours a night, and of course this is large scale research and every person individually is different, but statistically the most common is 8 hours, right? If you're sleeping 8 hours a night and then you get a night of 6 hours of sleep, you feel very tired the next day at the same time as your cognition, your cognitive effectiveness declines. I think my brain has decided that tired is just background noise. Yeah. After day 2 of 6 hours of sleep, you still feel very tired and your cognition has continued to decline. After that, your sense of tiredness starts to diminish. After about 2 weeks, you have no subjective sense of tiredness at all. Even though after 2 weeks of 6 hours of sleep a night, your cognitive abilities are similar to a person who is, if you had not slept for 48 hours straight. So obviously, if you went for 48 hours straight without sleeping, you would feel exhausted and you would be making all kinds of cognitive mistakes. If you do 2 hours of 6 hours or 2 weeks of 6 hours of night of sleep, you don't feel exhausted at all. You feel normal. You don't feel tired. And your brain is making the same level of cognitive mistakes. We over-rely on cognition. We don't measure like, how fast am I at this thing? Or how many mistakes did I make? We just measure, do I feel tired or not? And yeah, it becomes background noise. We adapt, which thank goodness we're built that way. Sometimes you're in a situation in which like you're only going to get 6 hours of sleep a night no matter what you do. So why bother feeling miserable about it all the time? It's good that we have processes built, like for people who had newborns and are involved in nighttime feedings and stuff. I know not everybody does it that way, but great to hear. Glad I take the bus to work. Yeah, and of course, when we're talking about like cognitive effectiveness, we're talking about like narrow margins, right? It's not like a person who's gone 48 hours without sleep all of a sudden can't use language anymore or whatever. And the reason that driving after 48 hours without sleeping is dangerous is twofold. One is the decreased reaction time and whatever. The other is the likelihood that you're going to fall asleep, but that falling asleep is a response to the subjective tiredness. So 2 weeks of 6 hours of sleep still reduces your reaction time, but it doesn't make it likely that you're going to doze off while you're driving, even though it's not safe, right? Yeah, people often talk about, new parents talk about like, you know, you're getting 4 hours a night of sleep and even that is interrupted and whatever. And at first, those first few days, you're just exhausted. And then you enter into this space where it's like, you don't remember what it was like not to feel that way. What about 20 years of 6 hours of sleep? So for an individual, it gets complicated because different people actually respond differently to different amounts of sleep. For some people, 6 hours of sleep is perfectly fine. There's so many like contextual things that build into it. But yeah, for sure, if you've been sleeping that way for 20 years, you're not going to feel tired when you sleep that way. And again, just generally, this is part of what I was talking about before. I'm not just trying to talk about like, do whatever you want. I'm saying sometimes you feel energized, or me, myself, right? There are times where it's like, I've been running around all day. I haven't had any me time. So I want to stay up and play a game on my phone that I haven't been able to play today or whatever. And then the next day, I got 5 hours sleep and I have 3 kids now and went through the long story. It doesn't matter. Got real bad sleep for a real long time and just got used to it. And now my sleep is better than it was when the kids were younger. Our youngest is 4.5 now. But still, I can get 5 or 6 hours of sleep in a night for several nights in a row without like feeling it. Like I never used to have experiences when I was younger, not never, but rarely did I used to have experiences when I was younger where my like eyelids are heavy and my eyes are grainy, like because I want to sleep that bad and then I just don't. Or if I did that, then like the next day I did it again. That's just most nights these days. I get to that point of like, oh man, I really want to go to sleep, but it's only 8 o'clock. I'm like, no, I'm going to wake up and do some things. And it's good that we get used to these things. Just like it's good that if you need to pee and you don't have access to a bathroom, it's not a good thing to just keep feeling that growing discomfort. It just gets worse and worse and you can't do anything about it anyway. So it's good that we adapt to these things. It's good that we get used to like background noises and I'm not constantly hearing the fan from my computer or whatever. And it means that we shouldn't always just rely on conscious perception because our conscious perception is filtered through that lens of what is useful, and what those processes determine what is useful is not always the same thing as what actually is useful. Yeah, I usually crash pretty hard on the weekend. So part of my aim of trying to actually do things on the weekend is trying to get more sleep during the week. Yeah. And there is like actual evidence of biological difference between like early birds and night owls. And the way that our culture is structured, the by far, it's way easier to get a good amount of sleep during a regular work week if you're an early bird and can go to bed at 8 and wake up at 4 and do stuff in the morning before work. There's all kinds of complicated things and I want to talk about more, but I got to get going. I'll be back same time next week, but we got to be wrapping up. And just know that like, yes, sleep is important, but it's not the only thing. There are other things that are restorative too. And there are some things that sleep can't restore and you have to do the other things. Like if you are, for example, if you're alone, if you don't interact with other humans, doesn't matter how much sleep you get, some bad things are going to happen over time if you have no interaction with other humans. And that's also true if your interaction with other humans are only harmful or, negative. There are other things that are restorative besides just sleep. Eating, for example, is another example. There's some things that sleep can't restore. No matter how much you sleep, if you don't eat food, you're still going to eventually die. There's other things you need to do. And so enjoyment isn't just like fun, and not everything which is enjoyable is actually important or beneficial, but enjoyment is an important cue, just like pain is an important cue that draws our attention and gives us an initial response of treating something as though it's beneficial. If we just start locking all that stuff out, it's going to be a problem. Anyway, thank you. Thanks, Best Insider, for joining with the chat. And be well, everybody. I'll see you next week.